John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11 is our passage, and it's the story of Jesus and his mother and his disciples and what happened at a wedding in one of the neighboring towns to where Jesus was born, or raised, I should say. John chapter 2, 1 through 11. On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk, but you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. I had the privilege of sharing in a time of investigating this passage with a group of seniors over at the lodge, the Lacombe Lodge, on Thursday afternoon. The Lacombe Ministerial has been sponsoring a Bible study time in the fireside room at the lodge on Thursday afternoons at 2 o'clock over the past couple of years. And these next 2 months, January and February, it's going to be my turn to take part in that. And so for those of you who live at the Manor, you'd be welcome to come join in those times of Bible study. We'd love to have you. And we were talking all through various aspects of this story and this miracle, and what does it mean? Seems in some ways like kind of a frivolous miracle, doesn't it? I mean, Jesus' miracles usually respond to a more urgent kind of need and a more life and death kind of situation. Whether he's multiplying food for a hungry crowd, whether he is healing blind people so that they can take up a life that is able to sustain itself and not just rely on begging for others' help, whether he's giving healing to people who are lame in their bodies or restoring those with leprosy to health and wholeness again, whether he's raising sick or even dead people from their beds, their graves. Those are all urgent life or death kinds of situations. But why this? Seems kind of frivolous, as I say, to take all of this water, 120 to 180 gallons of water, and turn it into wine. Us Nazarenes, coming from a tradition where we're teetotalers, we don't know what to do with this story, and makes us kind of uncomfortable, I think. My New Testament professor at seminary, the late Dr. Roger Hahn, would say to us that, on one hand, you shouldn't underestimate the severity of the need that is represented in this story, because for Jewish people, the Jewish people of that time, a wedding was probably one of the most major gatherings or events of the whole year. They were majorly celebrated in Judaism. They knew from their holy scriptures that the very first commandment that God had given to Adam and Eve was to be fruitful and multiply. And so they saw a wedding as an act of obedience to that commandment, and they saw it as a time for a major celebration. And rather than the couple having a quick party with their friends and then heading out on a honeymoon all by themselves, no, they stayed. They stayed for the whole 7-day party, usually at the father and mother's house of the groom. And so for this simple phrase to be in our story, the wine gave out, would strike fear in the heart of an ancient Jewish reader, would strike a sense of horror in their minds. Jesus would have known that in that culture, this would have been catastrophic to this couple's social standing. They might have been known forever after as that couple that didn't have enough wine at their wedding. It might have impacted their lives socially right to the end. So Jesus is meeting a real need here, but perhaps more importantly, we can see a variety of clues here that point to something bigger than just Jesus responding to a social need in this situation in that village of Cana. The text describes what happens here in verse 11, describes it not as a miracle, but as a sign, which means that we should be asking, what is the significance of this sign? What does it mean? How is it pointing us to something important for us to understand? Well, the Jewish scriptures that these people had, that many of them had memorized large chunks of the scriptures that they had been listening to in the synagogue and in the temple for generation after generation after generation, had been pointing for centuries toward the expectation that out of their exile that had happened already some 600 years before, and they had never really returned to a place of being owners in their own land, so to speak. They had always been in an occupied land ever since that time. Their scriptures had been pointing them to the hope that in the days of the Messiah, when their great king would come, there would be great celebration, there would be great joy and rejoicing. And it is symbolized by the abundance of wine, a drink which symbolized celebration for the Jewish people. Amos 9:13 says it this way, "The time will come, says the Lord, when the grain and the grapes will grow faster than they can be harvested. Then the terraced vineyards on the hills of Israel will drip with sweet wine." It's a prophecy of the restoration of God's covenant people after a time of great judgment and suffering and purification of their lives from their sin. Or we could look at Isaiah 25, verse 6, where it says this, on this mountain, Mount Zion, mountain of Jerusalem, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. Beautiful picture. The Lord God will prepare this glorious banquet. And if you go to that passage and read the entirety of Isaiah 25, you'll see that it's a prediction of the time when God will destroy the power of death. God plans to wipe away all the tears from the eyes of his people. And that passage of an abundance of wine spread as a banquet feast is there in Isaiah 25 as a prediction, as a looking forward with expectation to the time when God will do amazing things and will destroy even the power of death, symbolized by this abundance of wine and great food. Or you can take the passage that Ken read for us earlier from Isaiah 62. It's not talking about wine. It was talking about, do you remember? It was talking about a wedding. Between who? Between God and his covenant people. He says to them, "You shall no more be termed forsaken, and your land shall no more be termed desolate, but you shall be called, my delight is in her. Your land shall be called Beulah, married. For the Lord delights in you, and your land shall be married. For as a young man marries a young woman, so shall your builder marry you. And as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall your God rejoice over you." And so clearly this sign that Jesus performs, turning water into an abundance of wine at a wedding feast, says that he revealed his glory in this way. Clearly this is pointing to the coming of that great day that has so long been anticipated among the Jewish people, the day of the coming of the Messiah's kingdom, the day of this wedding, with its overwhelming joy and its extravagant love symbolized by its overflowing supplies of sweet wine. For God is drawing near now to draw his people into a new kind of covenant relationship, characterized by amazing love and by great joy. There are other important details here that fill in this picture of the meaning of the picture. For instance, the wine is produced from the Jewish water of purification, which symbolizes that the old covenant is to be replaced with something far better and greater. That the focus won't be on the Old Testament ceremonial law with its many, many commands and its minute requirements, which could be so overwhelming as it is laid out and what the people needed to do to keep themselves clean and pure. And we see Jesus in his ministry over and over again coming up against and getting into trouble with the Jewish authorities of that day because of his disregard for the Jewish laws of cleanness and uncleanness. He's constantly going into places that they considered unclean where he should not go as a religious leader. And instead, he is taking the purity and the cleanness of God's grace and love and purifying those places that had been unclean. But you can see that conflict there. Now it is symbolized in this picture of stone jars that were used for ceremonial cleansing, suddenly becoming the source of this beautiful supply, abundant supply of the wine of rejoicing. The focus now will not be on those Old Testament ceremonial laws, but it will be upon a celebration of marital love and the bountiful joy that such love brings forth. So it's important for us to remember that this isn't just any party, it is a wedding party. And as N.T. Wright, the great New Testament scholar, says, this detail is not insignificant because the whole of John's Gospel is all about the marriage of heaven and earth. They had been separated in the fall of humankind, and God has been seeking to bring heaven, the realm in which what he does and who he is most important, bring that together with the earth, which is the realm of humans in their rebellion and in their death and destruction that comes as a result of their rebellion against God. God is seeking to bring those two realms, those two spheres of existence into union. And that is the picture of what is to happen at the end of time, when there will be a full coming together of heaven and earth. John's Gospel is all about the marriage of heaven and earth in Jesus Christ, says Wright. That is the final purpose of God in creation. Not the final separation of heaven and earth, but their coming together in wonderful, fruitful uniting. And so this little party, this little wedding party in little off-the-beaten-path Cana, a dusty town that most people in this world have never, ever heard of, except through this, becomes a shining moment of glory shining through. A wedding party that unfortunately was going badly off the rails due to, poor planning, an inadequate RSVP system, maybe a mail strike. Somehow the communication had not happened as to how much wine was needed. Some other aspect of human frailty perhaps was at work there, but somehow this wedding party was going badly off the rails. But it becomes the occasion for Jesus to shine forth his glory. It becomes the occasion for us as readers of this text many centuries later to ponder the significance of God's desire to draw us to himself in the deep embrace of covenant love. It becomes the occasion for us to pause and to ask, Do I say yes to the question of my bridegroom? Will you have and hold from this day forth, for better, for worse? There's one more detail here that we should not miss, and it's in the very first words of the story. On the third day, there was a wedding. As readers of the gospel story, we are well aware of the fact that something momentous happens on the third day in this story. We're well aware that the third day has tremendous significance in the story of Jesus. On the third day, what happened? He rose from the dead. He was raised. It was his resurrection on the third day that is the climax of his story. And this clue in our story, on the third day there was a wedding, it points us in two directions at the same time. First of all, it's saying something to us that we should look in this story for resurrection power and glory at work in what's happening here in Little Cana. That this story is about the resurrection power of God and the joy of the abundant life that he offers to all who will come and accept his invitation to be bound with him in covenant love. But at the same time, it also casts a kind of shadow. For as one of my favorite musicians, Steve Bell, writes in his little booklet about the season of Epiphany, this phrase, on the third day, causes one to suspect that this new wine is not some kind of thin, bubbly stuff, but a rich, blood-red vintage. We can immediately feel the foreboding weight of these words, for the invitation from Jesus to become part of the body of his wedded wife comes to him at horrendous cost, comes at a cost of his life, laid down in agonizing, humiliating, blood-soaked sacrifice. And as he said to his disciples much later in instituting the meal of Holy Communion, as he gave them the wine, he said, "This is my blood. This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." And that is the nature of marriage in its truly Christian significance. Marriage itself can be considered a kind of martyrdom. It's accomplished through the willing death of the me in order that the we can come together in fruitful flourishing. I can't say that I've ever used that line in premarital counseling with any couple that I've ever married. I'm not saying that I'm not going to in the future. Marriage is a kind of martyrdom. This is how deep and how great his love is for us. He will drink the cup of death for us in order to have us as his bride. Frederick Niedner reflects on that awesome reality in a beautiful article entitled "Glorious Promises." He writes, "At every wedding we wait for the moment when we witness a bride and groom vow faithfulness to each other till death do us part. We think when we hear those words, or even more when we speak them ourselves, that the death will come to visit much, much later, at some far distant boundary of a marital union that is beginning today with such promise. We think that death that will part is a long, long, long ways away. But," he goes on, "death is already there. It comes to sit with us at the beginning, or else there is no glory, no gravity to the marriages we make by giving ourselves to each other. We do a weighty thing when we commit to sharing most intimately with one partner the brief and precious life each of us gets on this earth. But few of us see the full truth of this until we reach that inevitable moment that we named in our vows. Where is the climax of a couple's life together? At what point can they see the glory of their union? Not likely to be found in the swooning that leads them to marry, nor even in the act we call consummation. Does glory come finally in the fulfillment of having a family, or in the peace that comes when the nest empties? I believe, he goes on, I have witnessed the moment when marital glory reveals itself. It appeared during the dark of night in a dining room converted temporarily into a hospice center. My father lay in a bed there, dying, while I spent nights on a couch nearby and kept watch. Several times in that last week, I awakened to see my mother standing over my dad in the dim light. She hadn't risen from sleep to perform any kind of ministration to him. She simply stood for long minutes looking tenderly down at this sleeping man with whom she had shared more than half a century. I closed my eyes and kept still. Children aren't supposed to watch their parents' most intimate moments, but I wondered, what filled my mom's mind and heart as she pondered this face, this body, the person with whom she had spent her life? The whole of their life together, I think, is what she was thinking of. The full weight and glory of their marriage now became clear. All they would be together in time and space, the gift they could offer the world as one flesh, had grown to fullness and had been offered up. All that remained now was to let it rest in God's hands. John's Gospel says that Jesus revealed his glory in the first of his signs at a wedding in Cana, and his disciples believed in him. The narrative doesn't tell us just how much of that glory the disciples saw or understood at the time of the wedding, for as Jesus explained to his mother, his hour had not yet come. In the language of John's Gospel, his hour was the time of his crucifixion. In that hour, Jesus would take his own bride and his glory would be fully revealed. But for now, out in Cana, the disciples and Jesus' mother saw and tasted a new fine wine that would revive a failing feast. Glorious though it was, however, it was only the beginning. Another day came when Jesus asked for a drink, precisely at midday. This time he received it in the form of sour wine. And with it he took to himself his bride, the whole world of us, whose sins he bore by uniting as one flesh with us. With his mother and the beloved disciple watching, Jesus' glory was fulfilled, even as he himself declared, "It is finished." How fitting that Jesus' glory should commence its epiphany, that is, should begin to be revealed at the wedding of an anonymous couple in out-of-the-way Cana. Like Jesus' life and work, our marriages share in the same irony. The full weight and glory of each appears only when death comes to part the bride and groom. Here in the realm where death still appears at every wedding and sits silently through our feasts, we continue sharing the wine that Cana's guest brings to our table. Sometimes that wine is sweet and wondrous beyond all imagination. At other times, the wine proves sour, and we sip it from a sponge like those that the hospice people bring for times when the lips dry up and crack. But both drinks come from the same source, the one we share with the bridegroom who takes us as his own, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, and in whose arms we shall rest when death comes to close off all our other stories. And so we dress even now in wedding attire. We drink his wine and we give our hearts away in the breathtaking risk of believing, which is in itself a form of falling in love, really. And so we will come to the table in a few moments, and we will receive a cup of this rich red wine, grape juice in our tradition, of course. We'll be invited to drink deep of our Savior's love and to enjoy this rich gift. At the same time, this act of coming to the table and eating and drinking together there is our own small sign that we choose him to be our bridegroom. And we choose this path of self-surrender, of loving sacrifice, yes, in our marriages, and yes, in all the other relationships of our lives. As Robert Weber says, at the communion table, we take God's whole story into our stomach. We let it run through our bloodstream. We let it then energize our whole living, relationships, work, pleasure. All of life is to be lived now as Jesus lived his life for us and for our sake, dying for us, rising for us, showing us how to live in the pattern of his dying and rising. And as he took into himself the suffering of all humanity, so we are to take into ourselves the suffering of the world and do something about it. As he rose above all that is evil in the world through his resurrection, so we too are to rise to the new life by the Spirit of God. For indeed, that is what his love compels us to do.